Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on gaming climate change. I am James Pigeon Fielder, dialing in from Colorado State University. I'll be your moderator today, but the big portion will be, the balance of it will be for Dr. Ed McGrady, who's going to be talking about gaming climate change. So to give a short introduction for Ed, Dr. McGrady, he writes, he speaks, and he teaches on the design of professional games. He's an adjunct senior fellow in gaming at the Center for New American Security, teaches and manages game design courses for the Military Operations Research Society and Virginia Tech, and runs a business devoted to using games and game techniques to bring innovative experiences in new areas. In the past, Dr. McGrady built and directed a team of 10 to 20 analysts at CNA devoted to the design and execution of professional games. Dr. McGrady has written, taught, and presented on the topic of games and their use in organizational individual learning, and has designed and run games for many different clients, ranging from the White House to the Department of Agriculture. In the past, Dr. McGrady also built a team at CNA devoted to chemical and biological response operations, including domestic response operations. Dr. McGrady is deployed as an analyst with U.S. forces in Haiti during Operation Uphold Democracy, on board the USS Nimitz for Desert Storm, and with operational E2C squadrons. Dr. McGrady holds a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Michigan and has published extensively in the chemical engineering, physics, and national security literatures, and is widely cited for his work on the mathematics of aggregation and fragmentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ed McGrady.
Wow, you read the whole thing, Pigeon. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. What I'm going to be talking about today is gaming climate change, and so let's get to it. As soon as I can figure out how to turn the slide. Climate change games, if you think about them, they really occur at the intersection of a lot of very controversial topics: science, politics, economics. And they have a huge component of irrationality built into them. Now, what I'm talking about when I say climate change games are not a climate change game designed to teach you to, recycle your plastics, but rather a professional game designed for people who actually do the job they're representing in the game, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's science, whether it's leadership, whether it's industry. Those people are actually playing in the game for serious purposes. And when you get that mix and throw in climate change, you have to ask yourself what could possibly go wrong, and the answer is a whole lot of stuff. And so let's talk about what some of those things are. One of the things I constantly am noticing in doing climate change games is you get a lot of younger people who are very enthusiastic about participating in something that does not involve blowing stuff up and killing people. In other words, not a war game. When you say, hey, let's do a climate change game, everybody wants to work on it. Those people usually leave quite disillusioned with the problem. And so leave now if climate change games would help fulfill your ideals, because I will do my best to disabuse you of that idea. So what do I mean when I say gaming climate change? There's two types of climate change games, and one is much more common than the other in my experience from the professional side of things. But both are valid, they're just very different. One is the games on the impact of climate change. In other words, climate change is going to do something and you have to adapt to it. And within the community, this is called adaptation. How are we going to adapt to the reality of climate change, whether it's sea level rise affecting bases, whether it's the Arctic and ice going away in the Arctic and opening up in the Northern Passage, or what used to be called in DoD a long time ago when it mattered, small-scale contingency games, games on humanitarian relief, humanitarian disasters, security events within countries, caused by things like migration as a result of sea level rise, which displaces people and causes everybody to get grumpy. Those kind of games are focused a lot on the effects of climate change and what they're going to cost you, what you're going to have to do to deal with it. The other kind of climate change game is a game about climate change. We see the same thing with cyber, sort of cyber in games and then cyber games. And climate change games have to deal with the question not only of adaptation, which is expensive and requires you to plan and all that stuff, but also the issue of mitigation on the other side. And mitigation means reducing your overall carbon output and or somehow figuring out another way to manage the global increase in the projected global increase in temperature within the context of your game. And that little thing I just said, projected global increase, is an example of the kind of traps you can get into with climate change games. If I say the increase in global temperature as opposed to the projected increase in global temperature, I've said two very different things, and I can get myself into a lot of trouble if I say the wrong thing within the climate change space. So that's kind of where I'm going in this whole brief. Is it's a very tricky and dangerous sort of space. And with climate change games, climate change itself becomes a variable process. The players themselves have some remote chance of affecting climate change itself as a variable. And if they don't, they have extra adaptation to do, typically, because of it. The first case I see is a standard response game. You can have disease response games, you can have disaster response games, you can have small-scale contingency response games where you have a threat in a disaster. You can have humanitarian relief. These are all response games. You're working on the symptoms, not the cause. The second is much more complicated, and a lot of what I'm talking about here really does focus on the second kind of game, because if I'm doing a game on relocating bases, I'm doing a game on relocating bases. The cause is climate change, but I'm really relocating bases. I'm not actually dealing with climate change. To really deal with climate change from the holistic perspective, both mitigation and adaptation within the context of a game, you need to know a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, you need to understand climate change. This is not an easy problem to understand, despite all of the ink that has been spilled on trying to understand climate change. It's inevitably occurring in the future, which translates over some game design issues that I'll talk about in a second. It's a natural process related to carbon emissions, but carbon emissions in turn are connected to economic activity. And just like the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone, economic activity is connected to everything else that we do. And so you get to the point of going, oh, I need to model everything in order to have some sort of hope of being able to project consequences for player actions in my climate change game. So that makes it a little complicated. There's some game design issues that make it even more complicated. The first is that, and we'll talk a lot more about this later, is that climate change occurs over time. It's not something that's like an instant disaster. It's real easy to say, okay, the hurricane hit, let's respond to it. That's a response game. And so you can go and respond to the hurricane. It's harder with climate change games. A lot of the factors are interconnected. How do you develop simple abstract models of all these interconnected factors? The scenarios are very sensitive, not in a classified sense, but in the fact of political sense. If you go too heavy, people will criticize you for being too much of an advocate for climate change and not following the science. If you go too light, they'll do so likewise. If you go in the middle, both ends will criticize you for not following things. And frankly, a lot of the climate change games involve people that don't traditionally play in games, sponsors that don't traditionally sponsor games. And they bring with them sometimes insights that aren't necessarily traditional. And there's also what I call the dragons, and we'll talk about those last. And that's dealing with climate change people. It can be, I throughout this conference, I've actually advocated that game design is a management process as much as it is a design art form. And the management process comes really to the fore here. You have to manage your sponsors, you have to manage the people working with you, you have to manage all the players, you have to manage everybody within the ecosystem of the game in order to make the game successful and be perceived successful. Unfortunately, there's a lot of landmines and sensitivities in these games that can really derail that management process. So we're going to talk about each one of these main themes: climate change, game design issues, and dragons from the perspective of trying to design climate change games. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is climate change. And as I alluded to before, climate change is not a place you can go. It's not an event you can respond to. It's like, show me a picture of climate change. This is a pic. You say, "Well, this is a picture of climate change." No, it's not. It's a picture of a storm damage. That's an effect of climate change, but it's very hard to show me a photograph of actually climate change. So how are you going to design a game on something you can't photograph? Well, that's really hard. So let's get the elephant out of the room. Let's shoot the elephant first, which is climate change real? If you stuff carbon into the climate system, eventually you're going to perturb it. It's a basic chemical process or a mixture process. So you need to get over that if you're going to do climate change games. I assume most people who would do such games have. Because you're perturbing this climate system, it's going to have implications for national security. It's going to have economic implications. For example, one of the potential economic implications is in engineering processes like making paper or making power or any number of things that have things that whir around and do stuff. You often need water, and you need water at a particular temperature to help your process. Like you have a heat exchanger, you need to be able to have feed water for the heat exchanger at a particular low temperature, so it comes out the other end having transferred the heat. Well, if the water itself that you're using heats up, then that process becomes more inefficient. And the more inefficient that process becomes, the more expensive whatever you're making is. And so there's decided engineering and economic effects too. Social, political implications, typically talked about as mass migration, but there's all kinds of other things ranging from disease to the effects of mass migration, which we saw in one of my games, which would be increased radicalization within the first world states. But it's all not linear. And that's not a very popular thought. That's sort of my take on it. It's very much a non-linear process. You don't know exactly what's going to occur when, you don't know what's connected to what, but you do know something's going to happen. And then on top of that, there are all these natural climate fluctuations that go on. There is a North Atlantic hurricane cycle that's sort of a decadal time frame cycle. There's then climate change interposed on top of that decadal cycle in hurricanes. And that matters for your game because, again, I mentioned that you're going to be doing a long game, so you're going to be going many years. So these kind of cycles actually matter in terms of the underlying nature of climate. There's likely, I'm not an expert on it, but there's likely oscillations in drought in the American Southwest, which we can see from the archaeological and paleontological samples. And my assumption would be that we were in a wetter period in the Southwest, and now it's becoming a drier period. Climate change is a forcing function on top of that. And likewise, there's other nonlinear fluctuations, such as the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is the current that runs in the North Atlantic. If that gets out of whack, all kinds of weird things happen in the climate. People don't want to talk about that, but that's a potential another nonlinear impactor for climate. So you've got all these weird things that can happen and nonlinear effects that you as a game designer need to say, hey, okay, how am I going to take these things into account? Can I take them into account given the political situation? And how exactly am I going to incorporate them in the game? And then there's the types of games that should come about on climate change. You have to put yourself not only within the scientific context, but within the context of what you're trying to do. A lot of games, not just some, a lot of games have to do in their underlying objective with some sort of awareness, which is a charitable term, or advocacy, which is perhaps a less charitable term. People in the climate community want to try to get the word out that this is a deal, and it's a deal that's going to cause trouble, and that you need to prepare for it and maybe not want to do it in the first place, and so you do mitigation. So there's a lot of underlying trends and tendencies towards advocacy and awareness in the games. There's also issues of understanding trade-offs. If I do this, what happens? Especially when you start talking about things like geoengineering or adaptation versus mitigation. I can either put my money in adaptation or I can put my money in mitigation. How do I understand the trade-offs? And then understanding particular implications. You can do a game on the City of London, for example, which may or may not be a good example, but you can do a game on the City of London and project it out to 2050, 2060 and say, okay, what's going to happen? Or even better, I think they've done a game on it actually, City of Miami. Take Miami, look at the flood zones, look at the potential flooding, even before 2050, and say, okay, what are the potential implications for housing loss, for security, for simply the seawater intrusion in the aquifer, for underground utilities. If you put all your utilities underground and the salt water rises, you may have issues with the electricity and stuff. So those kind of games look at particular implications. So basically, climate change is complicated, and the underlying reasons for the games are also sometimes fairly complicated. The things to know about climate change, I'm not going to go into these in detail, except that the causes, there's a lot of different causes. It's not just people driving their cars or flying their airplanes. There's agricultural issues, there's power generation, there's transportation, which I just mentioned. There's industrial causes from things like chemical plants. And there's also natural processes going on. So if you're saying, I'm going to do a climate change game and I got to connect all this stuff, once again, you've bitten off a fairly complicated model that even the modelers aren't really very good at right now. And the effects are not always obvious. Warming is going to cause problems, but when exactly, at what temperature range will warming cause problems? In some models and in some suppositions, certain areas of the planet become uninhabitable due to the continuous high levels of temperature. They're uninhabitable for humans due to the high levels of temperature. But at what point would people start voting with their feet? That's a complicated and not obvious particular effect problem that you have. And then you have some really nonlinear things that come into play, particularly geoengineering, ocean current changes, which I talked about, changes in agricultural growing regions. And I put that as nonlinear because everybody says, well, we're going to run out of food because of climate change. And a lot of more naive games might assume something like that. In reality, agriculture is a commodity. Agricultural food products are a commodity. Prices will just shift to reflect availability, and in most cases, it's transportation and international border issues that actually cause and hoarding issues that actually cause food shortages, as opposed to I'm not growing enough of this stuff. And the other thing is that if you look at the growing regions, which I'll show you in a second, it's not going to be it's going to be a big problem for some, and it's not going to be a problem for others. So that creates social changes, and it creates social challenges that a lot of times the people that are worried about advocacy and awareness type issues don't necessarily want to deal with. The other problem, and this is a huge problem for designing games, is it takes a while, and it's less impressive in terms of changes. You might think it would be, okay, I'm going to lose 10% of my southern Chinese wheat crop. Okay, prices are going to go up a little bit, but it's not like an impressive problem. I'm going to have a Category 5 cyclone hit Taiwan versus a Category 4. Okay, it's going to do a bunch of damage, and it's going to be roughly the same as it would be if it was a Category 4. So you get into this kind of so what problem with respect to climate change, which does push people frequently into the more extreme scenarios. The other thing is I did want to talk about, I think I may have mentioned some of these things. There's some terminology you have to understand. Adaptation, mitigation is one of them. I come from the disaster response gaming community, and mitigation means something completely different than it does in the climate change community. RCP is a representative concentration pathway. That says, okay, given the projected economic activity and the projected carbon emissions from that, how is temperature or the concentration of gas in the atmosphere going to change, which in turn will change temperature. So that's the RCP. And so you get RCP scenarios represented as changes in overall global mean temperature. And then you have the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a godsend to you, sort of, if you're a game designer for this stuff. Because the IPCC puts out the assessment report, every couple of years that sort of tells you where climate change is going, where they think the best science, what is the consensus, it's called the consensus assessment report. A bunch of scientists get together, climate scientists, and say, what's the consensus on where we're going? And they don't just say one answer, they give you a range, that's the RCP, they give you a range according to RCPs. And what are the effects going to be? They map it all out, and they do it every couple of years. And so if you go to the IPCC report, that's generally the gold standard. But then on the other hand, given a lot of these other considerations, you may want to deviate from the IPCC report. And so that itself becomes a thing in your games. And if you want to, I put this up here because if you want to debate any of this stuff, you've already made my point with regard to the complexity of this problem and the potential way it's fraught in terms of different political issues. But let's look at some graphics. I took someone who was, I believe, 30, 35 right now, and the little death's head is when you're going to die. If you're kind of like 35 right now, and you live to the mean expected age in the U.S. And so as you can see, what we're seeing in the top left is the projected EPA projected, which is not IPCC. That's another thing. The EPA projected rainfall deviations. So blue is more, red is less. Deviations from the baseline, which is probably 20. The historical average, 86 to 2005. And you see the two RCP values. You see RPC 8.5 and RCP 4.5, which 4.5 is we dump less carbon into the atmosphere. 8.5 is we dump more. It's looking now, I think, based on what I've heard, like we're on a higher RCP curve than we used to be. But one of the issues is that as people migrate to, this is another dynamic that occurs in your game, is over time, as people migrate to electrical and solar, some of those driving functions are going to go down simply because we're going to be dumping less carbon in the atmosphere. How you account for that? What's the uptake and transition to EVs across the world, not just the US, across long periods of time between now and 2090? And that will give you what RCP curve you're on. Go. So again, this stuff becomes complicated in terms of projecting. But as you can see, if you go out to 2050, and my point here is if you go out to 2050, it doesn't look a heck of a lot different than 2030. There's some areas that are more intense, some areas less intense. The Great Southwest Drought, Arizona is probably in a little bit of trouble. You can see a lot of orange down there. The central southern states, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, low countries, look like they're going to get drier. But a lot of other areas are going to get wetter. And this is just up to like 2060. And so if you're looking at the forcing function for major disasters and major changes, you need to go out to 2050, 2060 with respect to your game. And that's a long time. We don't do those kind of games typically even in the military to project out that far because there's so many other confounding variables. I just mentioned the uptake of EVs, but you could also have technological changes. The master AI could have already taken over by this time. We could have had a war. Any number of things that might change these projections could occur that are very difficult to say, okay, well, I'm going to do a game and it's going to be realistic out this far in terms of my stuff. And the other chart is just rainfall totals in terms of number of days of historical rainfall, and you're going to see that you're getting a lot more. The bottom line is temperature. I'm sorry, number of days of temperature. As you can see, you are getting a lot hotter, particularly the southern states. Particularly as you get out to the 2070, 2090 timeframe, you're getting extremely hot. So the issue here is, as you look at these things, how am I going to take those into account in a game in a way that's meaningful for the decision makers that are making decisions across time, whatever time step I have, that are meaningful and represent the kind of inputs they would get and the kind of constraints they would be working on as decision makers within the game. So for example, if you have a player that represents the US Congress, or 5 players that represent the US Congress, how do I give them information that tells them what is going on with respect to the climate? Not just these maps of rainfall totals, so there don't mean anything to them, but in terms of, is Phoenix evacuating? Are you seeing major droughts in the Southwest? Are you seeing major fires in the Northeast? in the Northwest. Those kind of things are going into the leadership, and the leadership has to say, okay, am I willing to pull the trigger on mitigation at this point? And if I do pull the trigger on mitigation, is it going to do anything? And there's a lot of argument that there's a lot of sort of bow wave built up already, and your mitigation is not going to do very much, even now. So you're moving to the point of no return, and so then everything becomes adaptation. So it becomes very, very complicated to try to figure these things out. And this is just another example of an issue in the games is that if you want people to take it seriously and make political and economic decisions based on the threat, if you show them this graph, if I'm in any of the northern countries, I'm going to be going, it's looking pretty good to me. Yeah, sure, I'm not growing a lot of wheat in Texas anymore, but I'm growing a ton of wheat up in the northern Montana and those areas. So I'm doing really well, as is Russia. China's not doing wholly bad, because if you look at agricultural productivity, it's going way up. Now, there's a lot of things that mitigate this, but if I just show this to a decision maker in the northern countries without any other sort of incentives for them to take it seriously, they're going to go, well, with respect to agriculture, we're pretty good. Now, the southern tier countries, they're hosed on agriculture, and that's going to create a whole host of problems. But in terms of the northern tier countries, they're going to make different decisions. And that may not be the kind of decisions that really assist in the advocacy awareness kind of thing, because one of the last things you want to do is to have any sort of thing come out that says climate change is not all that bad for the northern countries. And so, so that's a challenge that you have in these games. So as I said, I'm teeing up. There's a lot of data issues. There's a lot of complexity in relationships. And that causes a lot of challenges in game design. So I'm going to stop and take a few questions at this point. One of the questions asks, to what degree have you incorporated into your climate games the issues of the migration of wildlife and plant life and reaction to changes in climate, and the need to move agricultural activities? If you're doing it on a decadal or the minimum turn you might do is 5 years or a decadal turn, a lot of those microeconomic decisions are going to be taken care of by people acting in their own best interest. I mean, the farmer's going to, some farmers are going to go bankrupt, other farmers are going to thrive in other areas. And most agriculture is industrial anyway, so it's just the companies will buy different land and move their agricultural production to different land. The key question becomes, is there transportation networks? Is there processing networks for the food within those zones where they're moving them? And that might be a harder thing probably to do. But nonetheless, I would not, unless I'm doing a game specifically targeted at agricultural migration, which would be a thing, then you would need to do that in detail. But in general, in a lot of these games, you're not doing that sort of thing in detail. And wildlife and plant life, unless you're doing it, again, for a specific purpose to understand plant and animal migrations and invasive species. And there's a lot of concern over diseases. A lot of these, especially in advanced countries, the migration of a lot of these diseases is not really a thing. We have advanced medical treatment capability. And so when you get some of these, like, for example, Zika, we can certainly mitigate very much because we have at least a rudimentary public health capability to go out and do things. So it becomes an issue in some of the less developed countries with respect to disease and stuff. But anyway, climate. So I don't take that into account specifically, but you certainly could try. But for all the reasons I listed before, it's going to be complicated. Climate change games seem particularly well suited for confrontation analysis. Have you tried it? I assume Professor John Curry asked this question because he wrote a book on confrontation analysis. He's a friend of mine. Yeah, climate change games could easily be adapted to, and I'm not really as familiar with confrontation analysis. I'll switch to matrix games. And you would think that they would work with matrix games, but the problem is that unless you have people that really know stuff, a matrix game is just going to be people making stuff up, and no one's going to believe that. Because again, as I say in the dragon section, these people are very, very invested in the science, and they know the science cold. And so if you get that wrong, your game, it's going to be pretty easily discredited. So you want to be a little careful, because some of these easy gaming techniques, like especially matrix gaming and possibly confrontation analysis, again, I'm not that familiar with it, would allow you to do things that aren't necessarily going to be seen as professional. The climate models used in the IPCC are not good at extremes, but those extremes are most important in games. Do you use the IPCC scenarios in your games? If so, how? My baseline is to use the IPCC scenarios, mainly for political reasons. I don't want to get in, I have a PhD in chemical engineering. I can do stuff. I can make calculations. I'm not going to do that, okay? These are the big brains that know this stuff, and I'm not going to second guess them. I'm going to use the IPCC scenarios. Now, what you can do is you can use a high RCP curve in the scenarios. They do put in some pretty high curves in the scenarios, and I have done games using those because that's what the sponsor wanted to do, is they wanted to look at, again, advocacy, they wanted to look at the problem of the high RCP, the very worst case scenario, and what that would do within the context of the game. And so, yeah, you can use those. I wouldn't necessarily go too far away from the IPCC curves, because when you do that, you're on your own, right? If you go to a curve that's not an RCP curve from the IPCC report, again, acronyms, lots of them, then what you end up doing is you're now responsible for all the adaptation issues. How much is sea level going to rise? That sort of stuff. And I'm sure there's reports out there, but how good are the reports? Do people believe them? Those kind of things come into play. The climate models used in the IPCC are not good at, okay, I just read that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to confront some of these problems and these pretty complicated issues with respect to game design. So what you have, the basic process you have in a mitigation sort of game, and also adaptation mitigation game, and the second kind of game I talked about, is that you have causes, mostly economic causes, also natural causes, that affect the environment, that in turn cause effects downstream in terms of flooding, mass migration, that sort of stuff. This all feeds back, because as the environment warms up, the feed water temperature goes up for the power plant that you're looking at right there, and that power plant becomes more efficient, has to burn more coal, more inefficient, has to burn more coal, or in this case, it looks like there's trains coming in and out. So let's assume that's a coal plant, or maybe it's a nuclear plant. I don't know. Looks like a coal plant. Let's assume it's a coal plant. It's going to burn more coal, which is going to emit more gases, which is going to have a feedback effect. So as you're doing these games, you have this sort of feedback effect that you have to try to account for. And you also have three very distinct areas that you have to worry about. First, in terms of causes, it's economics to emissions, to how you're going to control and affect emissions. And then when you get to the climate, it's all the IPCC and the literature that we just talked about. How are all those emissions that you're generating going to affect the climate? And finally, what are the disasters? How is that going to in turn affect things like sea level rise, and that'll create disasters, and how many people are going to be displaced? Any one of those things is a major challenge for you to deal with. Dealing with all of them in the game, plus allowing for feedback, can be extremely difficult in games. And trust me, I've been there. It's extremely difficult. But you need to be able to do something like this, because you need to be able to tell the players what's happening. And the players need to have their knobs and dials and levers to be able to change things in the game, to change this overall feedback process. So how do you do this? The first thing I have to ask in a climate change game is, what can the players actually control? So even at the nation state level, they regulate, but they don't necessarily control economic activities. For example, Bitcoin mining, or NFTs, which have just started. NFTs are extremely carbon intensive, to the point where artists are really unhappy that people are making them, because they're destroying the climate. So NFTs are a new economic force that just came about in the last few years, and nation states don't necessarily regulate that activity, and so they don't necessarily control that activity. They may regulate it, but they don't control it. So what levers and dials do the players actually have in these games? Well, to regulate NFTs, you're going to have to go to the economic side. You're going to also have to go to Congress, maybe even state and local, and there's going to have to be some sort of international agreement as well. So that is a sub game in itself, just to try to sort out the economic impacts. So what happens is most mini games default to the first kind of game, which is the disaster response game. And so what they do is they do a disaster response game, hurricane hits, and then they somehow bolt on climate change to that particular disaster. So it kind of becomes a disaster response game where they talk about climate change. That's not necessarily how you would necessarily game this. The real thing you have to do, in my opinion, is first of all think about what dials and knobs the players have. Then you look at the strategic level. You have to look at GDP, because you can't deal with NFTs, and you can't deal with a number of tons of wheat that's going to be trucked to market. You're dealing with GDP, total gross domestic product output from the country, which can be translated, believe it or not, into carbon emissions. Then those carbon emissions go into the IPCC model, puts you on an RCP curve, which has its magic effects of telling you what all the potential adaptation issues are that you have. So using the IPC as a static RCP curve, you can kind of iterate between the various RCP curves if you have to. I would not recommend it, because you're doing a dynamic curve where they actually just barely came up with a static one. And so you're really facing a challenge. But you can then say, okay, under RCP 8.4, which I think I'm on because we've just jacked up GDP for India by 5, because of stuff that the Indian government's doing. It's deregulating, it's getting rid of its bureaucracy, stuff like that. We just jacked up the GDP for India by a lot. Then we're going to be put on this new curve, and the new curve says Miami's going to go underwater by 2030. So good, we got it. Okay. And that's another thing is a lot of times you say, well, we just want to do a climate change game on the U.S. Okay. Well, in terms of mitigation, the U.S. really can't deal with it itself. We cannot mitigate climate change unless we do some sort of geoengineering. And so we got to get with other countries, and other countries have to cut a deal. And then that has to be monitored and authorized and stuff. So there's also this international networked effect. You got the interrelationship between the climate processes and the economic processes. You also have the need that you have a boundary condition problem on your game, that you can't just draw a boundary around a country and say, we're going to only deal with climate change here, because if you're dealing with mitigation, you have to deal with everything. And then even if you deal with all this, suddenly the players sign a treaty eliminating coal-fired power plant construction. Not power plants, but they've eliminated power plant construction over a 5-year period within a gradual phase out between 5 and 30 years from now in China, the US, and India, which are the big guys on that. Okay, now what do I do? Okay, and that does become a problem for your games. This is why it's extremely difficult, in my opinion, to design these things. So you kind of end up in this scenario adventure. You can project. Okay, so and remember, we're going out to 2090, right? We're not sticking with between now and 2035, because not much is happening between now and 35 on climate change. It's going to have to go all the way out to 90. So now I need to project GDP out to like 90. Well, we can get UN GDP projected growth rate numbers, or if you buy them from people that do these things, you can get them even more accurately. And what they show, based on my work at least, is that this is China's century, and next will be India, and then apparently Africa comes up, especially the area around Kenya, comes up as an economic powerhouse. But those GDP numbers, if you believe them, and if you straight line the GDP numbers, things happen. Whether that's realistic or not is another question. Can be converted to carbon emissions. But again, the players can convert this. Like, I've got my GDP, but now they're moving to wind, solar, and EVs. And so my carbon to GDP ratios are going to change because of this transition to the different kinds of vehicles. And then I've got my temperature curves. Once I get my temperature curves, I can see what RCP curve I'm on, and I can take that pathway and look at my adaptation problems. But the real problem I've encountered in these games are what I call the dragons, and that's the people problem. In these games, you have a lot of people that are really smart, highly competitive. I'm talking, Silicon Valley billionaire smart. I mean, I'm not talking about connection smart. I'm talking about real smart. Very competitive. Again, Silicon Valley billionaire competitive, not Washington D.C. competitive. Very committed to the problem of climate change, and the whole ecosystem. And the people you're dealing with, the academics are like this. The businesses and the billionaires that are sponsoring your game are like this. The people that are watching your game and it's going to go online and people are going to comment. All these people are like this. They're very committed. They're very smart. And they're very, very careful with the science and the claims. This can create significant challenges for both your scenario development. Remember, I talked about all that other stuff that was making it hard for me to build the scenario. So now I've got to show it to all these people, and they're going to have an opinion. And they're going to probably be smarter than I am about it, both in terms of the science and just generally smartness. And they're also going to be unfamiliar with games. They're unfamiliar with the need for abstraction. They're certainly not familiar with response and military type operations. It creates a lot of challenges for your control of the game. You have to deal with these people in real time. But even worse, it creates challenges in terms of the development process. It can be a very iterative and very sort of difficult design process. It's almost like you take 2 steps backwards for every step forward you take, because again, everybody's challenging everything on these various models and various things. You can also run into to advocacy and bias. This is, in fact, climate change within the context of the U.S. And internationally is a very political problem. You are not qualified, nor apparently is anyone else, including the IPCC, to definitively answer the question of climate change. But you have to do so in order to create a game. And so because it's so politically fraught, and you're creating a game and have to define your territory, and define your game, and define your scenario, you're actually making concrete something that is kept a little bit nebulous for political reasons, which can put you in a really awkward position as the game designer. It's extremely difficult to get a bunch of experts on this together and have them have a considered point of view that agrees. And so now you're going, I can't have 5 points of view in this game. I can only have one point of view as to what's going to happen in the future because the players have to react to it. And so that can really also tend to bog down your game. And so my general advice with respect to climate change games is charge extra because you're going to be suffering. You're going to have to deal with all of these challenges. These are management challenges, personal management challenges, professional management challenges. And you're also going to have to deal with all these scientific and engineering and economics challenges that you have to go through to put together a game like this. Now, again, I'm not talking about that event response game. I'm going to move I'm Cargill, and I need to move my agricultural production from Texas to Nebraska. Okay, that's a response game. Okay, it's gotten too hot in Texas. I'm losing too many cows. You don't want to know how that works. I'm losing too many cows. I'm going to move my whole feedlot production thing from Texas to Nebraska. Now I got to deal with everything that would be involved in any sort of operational plant relocation. Taxes, feed materials, transportation, regulation, all that stuff. That's an event response game. I'm talking about a game where people actually want to do away with the cows or limit the number of cows in order to not have it get so hot that cows can't live in Texas. So that's the kind of game I'm talking about. And I honestly, I charge charge more for them, because dealing with everybody involved, not just the sponsor, but the players, with the kibitzers, with the scientists, with all these guys, is a real challenge for the game designer, because you're trying to make real in your scenario what they are trying to politically deal with, both politically as well as scientifically. There's a lot of uncertainty. You can't tolerate uncertainty, because eventually things have to happen in your world, and so that you become a very much a badminton ball, almost going back, or a tennis ball going back and forth between the different sides. And so that takes extra time. It takes extra effort. It takes a hell of a lot of patience, and it takes a heck of a lot of goodwill to be able to deal with. And I think you just need to know and be aware of these kind of challenges before you start designing the game, which is why I want to do this briefing. So that's pretty much it for me. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you have fun if you ever have to design a climate change game. Just don't call me. I'll take questions from everybody, and you'll have to forgive me because I have to start a Zoom session right now.
So I did see there's another question popped up. Let's see, from Richard Lammers. Let's see, the climate models used in the IPCC effort are not good at extremes, but those extremes are the most important game. Do you use the IPCC scenarios in your games, and if so, how?
Yeah, I already mentioned that question.
Where the hell? I've been sitting here watching the entire time. Okay, you didn't hear this conversation.
No, that's okay, Pigeon. No, actually, I think I want to answer it maybe a different way, since we don't have any other questions. This is one of the challenges with designing climate change games. It's more likely, like that would be in huge quotes, air quotes. It's more likely that you're going to have a less extreme scenario. One, especially in terms of hope, we're going to hope for a less extreme scenario. The problem with a less extreme scenario is nothing's going to happen, or less is going to happen. Less dramatic stuff is going to happen. It may be more realistic, but it's less dramatic. And at the same time, you want to push, so that drives you as a game designer, as Adam's talked about, pushes you more towards the more extreme scenarios. But the more extreme scenarios are more unrealistic, and also the deviations of behaviors of all these other elements for these things are going to be more extreme and less predictable. And so now you're in an even more unpredictable situation with regard to things like the North Atlantic Oscillation and the way agriculture is going to respond, and the way everything we've talked about here, plants and animals are going to respond, and disease is going to respond. It's all going to be more nonlinear the higher temperature you go. Are you going to get areas of the tropics that are uninhabitable? And what's going to happen when that happens? And that's not as easily known as, 20% of Miami is going to be underwater. They're going to have to canoe out to their condominiums. That's a little more predictable.
And then in the Discord, Paul Works has two different questions. First, how do you see results being used, or how are results used? And then he wants further clarification. What do you mean by connection smart?
Hi, Paul. How are they used? Well, they can be used in any number of ways. One of which is, as I said, awareness. A lot of games are done for awareness, to sort of show the decision makers what the potential consequences of their actions are. A lot of times, if you're really trying to have application of these games, you're going to bring the actual decision makers together. Track 1.5, track 2, people that are either recently out of office or still influential within the government of the various countries you're dealing with. And you're going to put them in the climate change game and say, okay, guys, do what you're going to do, and we're going to show you what the consequences are what you're going to do. And that's a big source of awareness, because now these people are very close to the decision making that's actually going on within the government. So that's a important consequence with respect to these games. And frankly, some of the games I've done are actually in preparation for going to the IPCC and going and advocating for certain RCP scenarios and certain RCP pathways and certain consequences of that to be considered. In this case, it was actually what you asked is they wanted a much higher RCP pathway, and they wanted more extreme conditions because they thought that was more realistic. And so we did do an extreme scenario, just because that was what the challenge, that was what they wanted to take to Paris. It was the Paris one. They wanted to take the Paris meeting and try to factor that into the overall assessment. So you can do them in support of the IPCC assessments. You can do them with the key leaders. Certainly you can do them with principals. Sometimes they're done with principals, things like that. So they can have and can be designed to have a particular high level of impact, which only supercharges all the problems that I talked about here with regard to science, with regard to implications, with regard to design, and especially with regard to people. It just turns everything up to 11, so even better. Charge more. And connection smart, I meant really smart, but these people are smarter than we are as game designers. And game designers are really smart, so imagine how smart these people are. They're smarter than we are because they got billions of dollars and we don't. So,
oh, here we go. Gary Parker asks, you mentioned the faulty cause-effect relationship elements are the kiss of death for a game. Put in Gary's words. The real experts will torpedo the game immediately. Can you cover or repeat a suggested approach to estimating any such cause-effect components of a game, e.g., less cows affect gas, etc.?
Yeah, that's one of the problems, right? And it's all people, because if I do something that's not quite right in real time, so I'm doing the game in real time, right? So the game is on, and I got to make a decision as a controller. In a military situation, we kind of have some idea of the PKs, some idea of how things are going to go. We also have things like JWAM that we could potentially run to see, okay, you're shooting 50 missiles at an airfield. It's not defended. Yeah, it's a bad day for the airfield, right? But in a climate change game, when you start saying, I'm going to replace 50% of my fleet with EVs, I don't have a good intuitive understanding of what's going to happen when that happens. And it's real time. I don't have time to go off and consult a giant model or 300 academics and do research into papers on the internet, which are all things you can do to try to figure that out, and then make some estimates. I just have to make an estimate, okay? And I got 3 guys telling me one thing and another guy telling me something else, and everybody's going to be mad at me no matter what I decide. So it puts you in a very awkward position.
Okay, before I go to the next question, I want to say the confrontation analysis question from earlier was asked by John Hanley. So we'll let, was it John Curry off the hook this time?
Well, it was a John. I got close.
See, Richard Lammers asks, if people are the dragons, do you need to work with different people in your games?
We can. I mean, because if you're doing these games and they're relevant and they're going to have impact, you're going to be doing them with the climate change community, with this community. And so there's no way to escape that. I mean, sure, DoD runs climate change games mostly to figure out who's gonna hate us next, and what bases are going to get blown up or something by sea level rise. But for a real full-on climate change game, you're going to be working with the real people, or you're not going to be terribly relevant. And you can do not that relevant climate change games, like for a conference. You could do one here where you ran everybody through it. Everybody would be impressed. It would be a great game. You would have all kinds of causes and effects going off, but it wouldn't be taken seriously by the community, and that's or the politicians, and that's a lot of times who you're targeting. So.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm keeping my eye out on the Discord to see if anyone else has any questions. If anyone wants to type furiously. I did not see any on the YouTube stream itself.
Okay, well, I will say that I have to unfortunately go pretty soon because I'm doing one of the game labs. This is the roll-up game lab where we're looking at something completely different than this, and that's rolling up to different levels in terms of combat results. So in other words, how does a company relate to a battalion, relate to a brigade in terms of combat results? So so I'm gonna have to go to that. I encourage you to participate in Game Lab, but I really appreciate everybody's time, and I appreciate you listening. And again, if you have other questions, you can get my email and send me an email.